Egyptian tables and beds are, well, in a sense, very similar items, even though we don't tend to think of it that way today. After all, tables resembled stools in form, with either 3 or 4 legs supporting a horizontal top. As they are represented in relief sculpture and paintings, we see tables being used for work displays, placing religious items, placing food, although it's not clear that people ever sat at a table to eat. So in other words, it would be like having a buffet today where it sits on the side of the dining room. You put your food on it, but it's not on the table itself. Now, tables were most often shown in a rectangular form with splayed legs connected by stretchers. So here we see the splayed legs. You see they come outward slightly from what would be a solid rectangle. We see stretchers running between them. That is to support it. If you ever as a child built a table and simply fastened it by nailing or screwing it in at the top, you know how weak that is. We of course have a second stretcher here. Now it's following our general Egyptian design principles, which are the use of small pieces of wood, in this case relatively small stretchers and legs, and the top here looks like 2 pieces, maybe 1 solid piece that has cracked. And that's going to tell us that this is an upper class table, whereas our previous one, we see that patchwork where it's pieces of wood that have been put together. And this always gives us a sense of who we're dealing with, what kind of society we're dealing with. Now, they had other table forms. They had basically the equivalent of plant stands, etc. We don't see a lot of those today. Those tend to be the things that people throw out, not the sort of things that they pass down generation to generation, or that, get buried with a relative so that they can pass into the next world. Another form of furniture resembling both the table and the stool would be the bed, because it too essentially is comprised of 4 legs and a horizontal surface. Pretty straightforward. The surface was more complex, however, with side rails, a frame, and an optional head or footboard. In some cases, these are straight. Sometimes, as in this case, this is a Pharaonic bed. This is curved, in theory, to give some sense of elevation to the legs, for example, maybe elevation to the head. We see the headboard, the sideboards, etc. And we see the use of animal feet once again, which is going to be quite common. Now, less expensive beds, we would still see the animal feet, so that's just a decorative element, a decorative style that they're using. But then we would see slots cut, and this would allow for example, strips of leather to be woven across the bed. Sometimes that might be for, in other societies, strips of wood, but as we know, wood is going to be quite rare in ancient Egypt. And they have different forms. For example, we will see beds such as this, where this is actually woven with, it looks like reeds or rush, and we have a series of drill holes in there. And you can imagine reweaving your bed every so often. Hey, you could see your mother yelling at you when you're 12 or something. You need to reweave your bed today, mister. That's our family project. And you'd be sitting there complaining about it. It just wouldn't be good. But we see the use of these woven strips. Now, this is going to make it softer. Not only is it about resources, of course, we don't have enough wood to make a giant wood panel, but a woven surface is going to be softer to lay on. Now, we can imagine they also would have put something over the top that we would identify as a mattress, maybe a piece of fabric filled with some form of animal hair, which is quite common, maybe with bits of old fabric, maybe with bits of rush or straw or something along those lines. We also see these interesting headrests, and here we see a better depiction than that. They don't use pillows as such. They would have these wooden headrests that were meant to hold the body in place. Now, you look at that and think, wow, that's really basically a torture device. But it wouldn't have been, because they're used to it from a young age. How many of you, after all, can talk to your parents and hear about how for 6 months when you were a kid, you decided to sleep in the middle of the floor? And to you, that was perfectly comfortable. But to you today, you sit there and go, wow, that just hurts, just to think about. So it's the same thing here. And these could be made of stone, they could be made of wood, any material that they had on hand. Not the sort of thing that would be comfortable to us today, but again, you grow up with it, you get used to it. And we see a very interesting form. It almost looks Greek, almost looks like a Doric column, but in fact what we see is a reeded column with a simple square capital. Very, very simple, straightforward design, very simple form, but something that would have been functional and used by those who can afford a bed. Because I should point out, again, when we get into the lower classes, we would have our wall with a mud brick station taking the form of a bed. Your typical working class Egyptian wouldn't afford a bed like this. This is more Pharaonic. So they would have their simple platform and then maybe some pile of hay or something else to kind of soften it up a little bit. They might have something outside up on the roof that would be the equivalent of a sleeping bag. Again, something filled with straw or other material, but they probably would not go to the expense of this headrest, which is both decorative and useful in Egyptian society.